Good afternoon. I'm really pleased to see so many people here. As Kathy said, I've been busily researching this since I was at the opening of the memorial at Howard in July last year, and it was on the, as you would expect on a memorial, was the name and the date of the death of these people who had died, local people who had died in mines between 1886 and 2010. And it just struck me that that's not enough to know. These people, you could say, gave their lives. They lost their lives in their workplace, and quite a few of them in major disasters, not only in Queensland, elsewhere as well. So I started researching, and I think that's probably a job that'll take me the rest of my life before I'm satisfied with having enough information. And as I've gone on, I've just realised how much there is to learn. So what I've done is divided into three, and Kathy's agreed that I'll do another session sometime next year when I will have been able to do some more research. So I'll focus on the first part, the early deaths, and talk about 5 men who, about whom I've found varying amounts of information, and that's only 5 out of the 30. And I correct the publicity that went out that there's 40. That was my fault. It's 30 at the moment, and we are likely to find out about more through the process. I'll just give you a little bit of background about the Burrum coalfields. I presume a lot of you would have some background already, but basically they started in 1863 when two brothers discovered coal on the banks of the river and thought that it was mineable and they could make money out of it, which they did for a while. But then a politician came in and sort of gazumped them. But it went from there, and the coal was very high quality and was a very important part of the development of this area from that time. The last mine closed in 1996, so there's quite a long period of the mines operating. When I started looking into it, I discovered that quite a few of the people who came to the mines, unsurprisingly I guess, were immigrants from Scotland, but then from England and Wales, and I've discovered 1 Irishman. The Scots included Andrew Fisher, who became the Prime Minister, first Labor Prime Minister of Australia after the Commonwealth was formed, and William Rankin, who came from Scotland in 1883 and became the manager of the mines, and as like his son then took over, and then his son took over, so they sort of started a dynasty in Howard. And the first senator from Queensland, female, was one of the Rankins, so they're quite an important family. One of the things I discovered, and I just thought, well, how come all these people are coming over? I know that we know that that's what happened, but what was happening where they came from? And just in one sentence, is that on, Kathy? Is it on? No. There was a period of downturn. There's a bit of debate about whether it was continuous from 1873 to 1896, but there is agreement on those being the beginning and end points. And so a lot of people would have come over because their passage was paid for. They were expected to pay it back, but not all of them came into Maryborough, but those who did, they could quite likely get employment straight off the boats because the employers knew the boats were coming in. They would go and grab workers. So they would have come with a lot of hope. And that's where it becomes very sad. I'll just go through those 5 people that I mentioned. The first man who died on the Burrum coalfields was William Snedden. He was 50 when he died. He was crushed by a fall of coal from above. One of his sons was working with him at the time and witnessed his death. That was all I really knew. And so then I had to go delving and finding who was this man, who were his family. And after quite a lot of fairly persistent research, learning as I went on how to do it and how to find out information and how to be fairly sure of the accuracy of the information, he and his wife and 5 sons arrived in Queensland on the 15th of January 1884. They came from Cockpen, I don't know if that's the right pronunciation, in Midlothian in Scotland, which is the area where Edinburgh is. And that family had moved from one of the towns to another, I'll show you in a sec, over the period that I could get information about, because the census data in Scotland was very good. He was a coal miner, and his oldest 2 sons were also coal miners when they left. The family sailed from Scotland on the Linlithgow Shire sailing ship and arrived in January 1884. 2 years later, William had died. The sons who came were Charles, who was probably the witness to William's accident, James, William, John and George, but the ages you can see there. The second son, Walter, and 2 daughters didn't come, and I haven't established why that was the case. On this map, this is a pointer, isn't it, Kathy? Sorry for my naivety. If I knew how to work it, that would be good. Anyway, the family had lived in Libberton up there, Gilmerton, Lasswade, and then Cockpen was where they finally lived before they left. So that surprised me, because I thought that people it's not a big area, but in those days you would think that people would probably be in one place, but they moved, and so the kids were born in different places over that period. And most of those, like Libberton and Gilmerton, are now suburbs of Edinburgh. I've just got a slide of the Linlithgow Shire. That was the ship that they came out on. There'd be hundreds of people on these ships. And this one came into Queensland. I'm not sure whether they got off in Brisbane or whether it left people at other ports along the way. As you can see, I'm just aware of gaps all the way in my knowledge. Now, some of the difficulties in finding this sort of information is I found 7 spellings of Snedden. He was born under Snedden with 1 D. He was Sneeden in the 1881 census, Snedden with an A when he married, and Snedden, double D-E, when he arrived in Australia and at his death. So establishing the right person was quite difficult. Another thing which I haven't actually written down, but Ancestry.com has deaths, information about the deaths of people, and quite often it has parents, and I went off on tangents because they had a mother's name down and I couldn't find a person who had that mother. And I've discovered that a few others, I would, if you're ever doing that sort of research and Ancestry says what their parents' names were, ignore it. The father might be right, but the mother might quite likely be wrong. The women tended to have a lot of children, so the woman that the father was married to at the end of his life may not be the same person as at the beginning. So that was just with the surname. The recording of the age was different. So what his accurate age was is a little unsure, because the age when he embarked was supposed to be 44, but he may have put his age down to be able to get his assisted passage. But that's, again, something else I'd need to look into. So that becomes confusing when you're looking for a person of a particular age, and that might be different in different documents. His wife is both recorded as both Helen and Ellen, and her name is very like his. So I had actually quite quickly found a William Snedden, who came from Scotland to Australia with two brothers, who then all absconded. And so I thought, oh, this is interesting. They were being chased by the police for absconding from their obligations to pay back their assisted passage. And it was the wrong one, because I found when he died. So it was the wrong one. So then I had to go back and keep looking. So after William died, like from 1900, you start to be able to get more information from within Australia. Helen remarried Joseph Armstrong a year after William's death, and then I haven't been able to find her, but I will keep looking. James, three of the sons, Charles, the eldest son who came, disappears from the record. And again, I will see if I can find him. I can't find him in Queensland. James married Mabel Maud Mundy, and they had 4 children between 1903 and 1906. John was a coal miner. He married Euphemia Rees, which is a well-known name in the Burrum area. They had no children. John died in 1949 and Euphemia in 1951, so it's sort of getting quite close to home, isn't it? And then George married, the youngest son married Ellen Hurley, again a well-known Howard name. They had 3 girls and a boy between 1909 and 1918. Now, I haven't researched any further, because this is an issue I'd like to discuss with people at the end. What are the ethics of looking into someone else's family unless you're in contact with that family? I'd just like to know what people think about that as an issue. So, sad story, but the family stayed and thrived, apparently. So that, maybe very sad, but not all bad. The second death, John Rattray Jamieson, was also from Scotland, a lot younger when he died, 28. He suffered a fatal spinal injury when he fell from a suspended scaffold down 90 feet. He didn't die immediately. He was buried a few months later. He was born in Cambusnethan in Lanarkshire, which is the area where Glasgow is, south of Edinburgh, sort of south and west. He was born in 1859. I haven't yet found a decent map of that part of Scotland from the right period of time. Funny that I could find it for the other one, but I couldn't find one for this. He was the son of a colliery manager, and I thought that was probably a bit unusual too, that he would have been sort of slightly higher up in the pecking order of Scotland at the time. In 1881, when he was 22, he was listed as assistant mine manager to his father in a coal and ironstone mine. His parents had 8 children. John was the youngest. Margaret died in 1873, his mother, leaving the oldest daughter, Catherine, to care for her father until he died in 1904. So I think John arrived in Sydney on the Ellora in June 1883. Again, not that long before, he wasn't here very long before he was killed in the mine here. He was recorded as a labourer from Lanark. We don't know how he got from Sydney to the Burrum area, how and why that happened. He was only 28 and seems to have been single when he died, but again, more research is needed to confirm that. He was a little bit easier to find because of having that middle name, which I found on one of the documents. That's the ship that he came out on. Again, that looks so small. Lewis Thomas was the third man to die. This is such a sad story. Well, they all are, I guess, but he was late for work, so he just walked into the cage and it wasn't there. Oh, and the fellow workers heard him bumping on the way down. And in the Maryborough Chronicle a couple of days later, they said the night was bright, the place was well lit at the time, and others say that a glance would have shown him that the cage wasn't there. So he would have just walked in mechanically. He was born in Wales and died leaving a wife and one child. And this is again where we find more difficulties in finding some people. I found that a good place to start is often the passenger lists of people coming from the UK. The Queensland ones are excellent. They're very easy to access and very thorough, just everything you want. New South Wales comes second and Victoria is way third. You have to go through a process to even be able to access them. So I've only been able to find people that I could establish came into Queensland or New South Wales. Now, the problem too was the number of Lewis Thomases born in Wales about the right time. Yeah. I even tried Thomas Lewis just in case they got the name the wrong way round. Because there is a Thomas Lewis buried in Maryborough Cemetery with a little pithead on the end of his grave. So he presumably was a coal miner, but it was much later. I couldn't be sure if I've found the right man at all. So I had to give up on him after I must have spent a couple of weeks at least. I thought, nope, I've got to move on. So I move on to another one who is also difficult. But he was fatally injured when a fall from the roof. I think he was a shot firer, and so he set the charge went off, and the coal fell on his head and killed him. He was a member of the Protestant Alliance Society. Something I've noticed that this is pretty much pre-union. Well, it is pre-union. And so a lot of the miners belonged to these organisations that gave them some insurance, and they've evolved over time into insurance companies. But at the time they looked after people of that faith. The motto of the society was fear God, love the brotherhood, honour the king. Or queen, presumably. Then, he would have been able, his widow would be able to receive payments from that fund. How much and for how long, I don't know, but at least there was some financial security of limited sort. He had no children. He was buried at Howard Cemetery, and his wife attended, accompanied by the local Member of Parliament. Now, one of the facts I did know was that, was in the information I had, was that he came from Ipswich and his wife was still there, and that was confirmed by this article in the Maryborough Chronicle that he was from Ipswich, I can't find any evidence about a marriage, who his wife was, or whether there were in fact no children, because I'm a little bit doubtful about all the facts I read in newspapers from the time and else. But the problem is Philip Stevenson, spelt with a V. If that's correct, which is in the Maryborough Chronicle and on his death record, I can't find him. I can't find any young man of that name who came in at the right age, during the right period of time. It could be that he came into Victoria because they haven't been able to access those records. But the thing was, I found a young man called Stevenson PH, who arrived in Maryborough on the New Guinea, which was the same ship but not the same time that Andrew Fisher came out on, in 1886. So that's the right place, the right time, right age. And I found a young man of the right age who lived in England with his family, and I found him in the census, 1871, 1881. This young man was born in Felling about 1862, and he had lost his father sometime between those two censuses. That young man had two older brothers, John and George, quite a bit older than him, and a sister 7 years younger. But is that our Philip Stevenson? It's really hard to know. And one of the things about a name like that, Stevenson, and I think it's the same with Snedden, is it's different according to where the person came from. So one part of England, not very far away from another part of England, will spell the name differently. So the person who's recording it on the ship, or the person who's recording it on the census, whatever, may just spell it the way they know it, rather than the correct spelling according to the documentation. So here's another guy that I need to do more research on. Perseverance is necessary for this job. Now, David Keane, I think he's the one I feel sorriest for of the lot. He was 37 when he died in 1896. He was fatally injured due to an explosion. Now, I talked to some of the minor guys from Howard about what this all means, but I think, because he closed a door, it meant it pushed air in a different direction than it should have gone and caused an explosion. Now, back in those days, they had bare flames for their lighting, underground, where there is gas. If the gas ignited, it would then ignite the coal dust in the air, and that's where you end up with those really massive explosions. This one wasn't a massive one. He died 2 days after the accident, and he was able to explain that he didn't realise that there was going to be a large accumulation of gas because he thought somebody else had already been through it, and he didn't use the safety lamp. That would, we know people do that, they cut corners. He was born in Cheadle in Staffordshire in England. His father was David. There was a lot of Davids in this family. Again, sort of that, the unexpected instability rather than stability. In 1851, his father David was an innkeeper, and that would have been about the time that David was born, I think. In 1861, he was an agricultural labourer, a copper smelter in 1871, and a smith striker. I don't know what they is, maybe somebody can explain. In 1881. David was the fourth, the David who came out was the fourth of 6 children. His mother died in the 1770s. I haven't managed to track that down yet. And his father in 1898. So we don't know why he came out. But he married a woman called Alice Craven, who was born in 1857. She died in 1919, quite a bit after him. Their oldest 2 children, Ada born in 1883, and John William, born in 1885, came to Australia with their parents on the ship Dorunda. Now, Dorunda came through Malta. I'll tell you a bit more about, well, you can read about the children. Like, the family was still around right up to 2006. Because there was David after David after David. And the census information is very helpful, and the electoral rolls are very helpful. If there are a number of people at one address, you can find them all together under the same surname. So it was really easy to find, because we had this precise place of birth, so there was no doubt when I found him that this was the right man, because you get the passenger lists at one end and you get the place of birth at the other, and it makes it fairly easy. These people are almost alive to me now, you know, because I spent so much time with them. Now, this was the ill-fated Dorunda. It picked up cholera on its journey after Batavia, which is Indonesia. It went through Malta, Egypt and Batavia, then people started showing symptoms, including diarrhoea. An 18-month-old child died, but the ship just kept going. The doctor decided, no, it's not infectious, don't worry about it. But then another man and his 2 children died, and the medical inspector in Townsville and the doctor decided, yes, it was cholera. So the ship was taken straight down, went straight down, quarantined at Peel Island in Moreton Bay. So all the people had to disembark, and they were left there for weeks. So you can imagine, you come all the way from England, and you and your family been knowing that there are other people who've died on the ship. The ship was fumigated, and all of the passengers' belongings were burnt. So they ended up with nothing. At least 16 people died and 75 were treated. And David Keane and his family were passengers on that ship. I just think that is so extraordinarily sad, that there you have this person who came with his family, presumably very hopeful for a really good future. Not only are they caught up with this quarantine on the ship and they survived that, can't imagine what life was like for them after that, But they had more children, and the children had children. Some of them stayed around, so there is a happy ending, I guess. Now, because of the amount of time I spent on each of those 5 individuals, I haven't had much time to look into the rest. And I'm really pleased that Kathy has agreed that we can come back and do another session next year when I've had time to research some more. So basically what I've got is the names, how old they were, in some cases where they were born, or at least some idea of where they came from, and how and when they died, which is a little bit more than I had with the first lot in some cases. And I'll just tell you the story of how I started this. I naively thought, if I go to the cemeteries and find these guys' headstones, they will tell me things that will help me then follow through. And I was absolutely shocked when I went to the cemetery, and one of the first graves I was going to look at were 2 man and son who died, and I discovered that the older man's wife had a baby a couple of months after he died, and the child died the next year. Those 3 people are in one grave in Howard and there is no marking. And that to me is awful. So I thought, well, I'm not going to let these people just be forgotten like this. And that was really a lot of the impetus for starting to do the work. I didn't think it was right. You know, you see somebody else's grave next door or down the road, down the row, that's been in the forces, and they've got a plaque indicating that they've been in the forces. To me, what's the difference if they die in a war or they die in a mine? You know, they've given their lives for other people. That's my perspective. If anybody recognises any of these names, has any information, I'd be really happy to talk to you later. Edward Stafford is, I know a little bit more about because his grandson is still around at the Burrum Museum in Howard, Burrum District Museum. Yeah, he just happened to be standing beside the boiler when it exploded. He wasn't an actual miner, but he was a worker at the mine. It's just, James and William Wood were brothers, and their graves are next to each other. They do actually have headstones. There was, 3 years between when the 2 brothers died. Ona Steely, obviously a member of, well, if you know Howard, a member of one of the first families of Howard, died, and actually his grandson, I think, is, or a relative anyway, is cameraman for Win News. I know I couldn't find any evidence about where Stanley Hine was buried, and that's because through Rod Stafford, who's at the museum, he told me that he found out through talking to the family that his ashes were scattered, and that's why I can't find any record of the burial. But there are cemetery records that are helpful. They give some information, but to go around to Howard and Maryborough cemeteries and not to be able to find anything to show for the deaths of these men and therefore their lives. So that's part 2, which I want to follow up each of those men, but that's where the issue of being in contact with the members of the family becomes really important. Now, the 3rd section is about disasters. The first one being in 1900. 5 men died at Torbanlea in 1900. And that again, to me, it's just extraordinary. When I mentioned about the father and son, that was Alexander and John Houston, and it was his 10-month-old daughter that was also buried in the same grave. Frederick Griggs, and I couldn't understand why, when I did I'd finally find a very well-kept looking gravestone. Amos Gamby is in the same grave as Frederick Griggs. And that was a matter of curiosity to me. Turns out Amos Gamby was married to Frederick's sister, Sarah. So they were brothers-in-law. And that's where it gets really sad, when you see more than one member of a family being killed in one or more incidents. James Johnson, he was another one that was very hard to track down, because some of the information is Johnston, and I spent a long time, probably the most time, trying to sort out him. And when I finally worked out who he was, is James Johnson. And so half the documents had Johnson, half of them had Johnston. and fortunately it's Johnson that's on the memorial. But I've done a bit of research about these people, but not as much as the first 5. And here, for the first time, I got photographs. And that's something that, if I can get in contact with families, I would really hope that we get some photographs to supplement the information we've got. That's Amos, that one over there. Is Amos Gamby and Frederick Gregg's grave, if I can work out how to word it. Oh, okay, I'll do that. Didn't work earlier. Now, 1902, this was one that I only found out about because I was sitting at the table at the Burrum Museum chatting to the guys, and they said, I think there are a few more, not just the 26 we got on the memorial. I think there's some more. There was somebody called Hewlett who died in 1902, and there was Brian Rasmussen who died in a box flat. So they asked me they were certain about Brian Rasmussen, but they were not sure about Hewlett. So I started looking into it. What was this thing in 1902 in New South Wales? It was the biggest industrial accident in Australia to date, to right now. 96 people died in that explosion. The coal mine managers were at a meeting with the government telling them, oh no, our mine's fine, nothing's going to happen here. Bang, it goes off in their mine at the same time as they're denying that anything will happen in their mine. Some of the men who died were the rescuers because there was so much gas in the mine that they were asphyxiated. So quite a few of the men were asphyxiated rather than directly hit by the explosion. Now, from what I've read, I think William Hewlett, the youngest son, was at the site, at the main site of the explosion. Alfred Hewlett was asphyxiated, and can't remember about Reynold Hume. But I don't know how many of you come from Howard or know Howard, but one of the institutions of Howard is Van Couten's Drapery. I went into Van Couten's Drapery and was talking to Trevor, the proprietor, because somebody said, oh, he'll know. So I went to him and he told me, yeah, there were 2 Hewletts, so that set me off on looking for the second one. And he said, oh, and by the way, there was a 3rd man as well. So then I had to try and find this 3rd man. And it was all a little bit difficult because the names recorded in the newspapers, it took quite a while for all the names to be recorded. There was a 4th Howard man, Charles Whitby, who was there at the time, and he was a witness, and he actually wrote a letter home, which was published in the Maryborough Chronicle. So I got a bit more information that way. So I did quite a bit of work on this to establish, we had to try and establish whether or not they were miners in Howard before they went down there, and discovered that once again there was a downturn, they left. And this is like a pattern. When there's an economic downturn, less people being employed locally, so they go elsewhere. And that was increasing as each of the mines started finishing up and closing off. So those 3 men, Alfred and William Hewlett, Reynold Hume, we found that they were definitely miners, and so they were added to the memorial this year, and so was Brian Rasmussen. So there are now 30 names on that memorial. I meant to have a photograph of it, but sorry, I haven't. There were more explosions more local men's deaths. Up at Mowra, there were 1975. There was an explosion. I've put that map in there so it indicates the different mine sites, and Kayanga is the one at the bottom in that map, and that was where the first explosion, 13 men died in 1975, and those bodies haven't been recovered. Again in 1986, 12 men died in an explosion. It's just, these are the big disasters of the explosions. 1986, Ernest Sleep was from the Burrum District, and he was one of the 12 who died. And then the very last, Howard District, Burrum District miner, to die in an accident, an explosion, was William Joynson, whose family is still in the area, I understand. And he died in 2010 at Pike River in New South Wales. You might remember that one. But the New Zealand government is working very hard to open the mine safely so they can go in and actually find out exactly what happened and retrieve the bodies. So I imagine, I keep checking the website, they've actually got a Pike River Mine Recovery Authority over there who's in charge of trying to work this out. And I think technology's improved enough in 8 years for them to really start planning on doing it. And what the latest I read was it may happen as soon as February next year. And I think if that happens, then hopefully William Joynson will come back, and then I hope to have got some more information about all of that. But so we come to the end of all the 30 miners who died. So I was thinking of getting boxes of tissues to hand around just in case. But I guess you can understand my passion for this, that, it's just terribly sad if people die like that and are forgotten.
On the 10th of November this year, Mowra, the 3 explosions in Mowra, they have a memorial. They opened a huge memorial in Mowra.
I did actually see that was happening. Yes, I wanted... Yes, I think it would. I want. That's another thing about the 1902 one. There's the local men are buried down there. There's a cemetery with 33 people in it, and there's memorials and things, and they've had a lot of ceremonies, 100-year ceremony and things like that. And I knew that Mowra had done memorials, and there's a memorial at Pike River as well. So I want to get a lot more information. It's painful sometimes getting this information, and it'd be even more painful if I'm talking to the families, which I may be doing right now for all I know. Yeah, so I want to do a lot more work on that and be able to come back with more information, more stories. As you can tell, there's a lot of gaps to be filled. I've got acknowledgements there because you never do this sort of thing on your own. And I've got to thank Kathy because she organised for Ancestry.com to be available in Howard, so I didn't have to leave Howard to research Howard, which was good. And I'd like, if we've got time, to just get some feedback from you, anything you'd like to add, but also what you think about the ethical issues of pursuing people's families, getting more information about those families of the people who died.